All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Pastoral Bible Study, going through the book of Daniel right now. And tonight we're going to be starting Daniel chapter 8. But I have some news. We're actually going to be splitting up Daniel chapter 8 into two parts, because if we were going to try and condense everything that we can get out of Daniel chapter 8 in one night, it would last a long time. And I even suspect that the part 2 will actually last longer, and tonight may get out a little early. But I just thought that it would be a good idea for us to dive into the first part of Daniel chapter 8 and then wait till part 2 to go over some other things. So tonight we're going to be going over half of Daniel chapter 8, and it's going to be very, very much corresponding to Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. So important to remember, Daniel 8 actually builds upon Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7. So tonight we're actually going to have a quick recap. I'm not going to go too much into detail because Pastor Doug did last week, but I do want us to just have it fresh in our minds of everything that we've gone over in Daniel chapter 7 specifically. And we're also going to go over some context as well, just with when Daniel chapter 8 was written and stuff like that. So we're going to start out with that. And so just recapping with Daniel 7 and when Daniel 8 are written, Daniel 7 was written in the first year of the reign of Belshazzar. And so Belshazzar is the son of Nabonidus. And so he's the one that takes over of Babylon when Nebuchadnezzar passes away. And so in the first year of the reign of Belshazzar, that's when Daniel has his vision that we talked about last week. This week, we're talking about Daniel chapter 8. This happens 2 years later. So this happens 2 years later. This is the third year of the reign of Belshazzar. And so when was this? Well, the first year was 553 BC, and then the third year was 551 BC. So Daniel chapter 8 tonight that we're going over was written 12 years before the fall of Babylon. And what I find so fascinating about Daniel chapter 8 is that it goes into a lot of prophecy that has already been fulfilled, but at that time, it was unheard of that something would be prophesied that far ahead. And so we're going to be going over that tonight and how this was prophesied even 12 years before Babylon fell. And this is talking about even 2 empires ahead. So when did Babylon fall? Well, this fell in 539 BC. And it's also important to note that as the account goes, Belshazzar, this is the guy who was reigning, he was acting as king in place of his father Nabonidus, who was away on a 10-year or so vacation, as the account goes, and we'll actually find out where Nabonidus was having this vacation because it's actually important to the story of Daniel chapter 8. So if we recap, we know that Daniel 2 with the statue, we now go into more detail of that dream and that vision with Daniel 7 with the 4 beasts that come out of the great sea. So real quick, Daniel chapter 7 recap. The lion with 2 wings. Who was this? This was Babylon. We talked about how at the Ishtar Gate that we can see in Berlin, there's lions with wings everywhere. And this was representative of Babylon. And wings equals fast. And so Babylon conquered quickly. Israel is one of those nations that were conquered by Babylon. Then we get to the bear with 3 ribs of Daniel chapter 7. So who is this? This is Medo-Persia. Also, in secular textbooks, like Doug had talked about, it's just known as Persia, and that's just because the Persians end up being way more powerful and ultimately take over the empire. And that's why it's lopsided when one side grows up more than the other. So Persia was greater than the Medes overall. And then we knew that the 3 ribs that are in its mouth represents the 3 empires that it conquered and it devoured, which was Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt, which up until this point in the Bible, Egypt was a very, very strong power too. Then Daniel chapter 7, we also see this leopard. It has 4 wings, and it has 4 heads. Who is this? This is represented by Greece. And leopards are fast. 4 wings make it extra fast. And so when you add leopard with 4 wings, it's very, very fast. And we'll actually see how fast indeed it was when we talk about Alexander the Great tonight a little bit more. And then the 4 heads equals the 4 generals of Alexander the Great that take over after he passes away. Then we see the great beast with 10 horns. Who is this? This is Rome. And the 10 horns equals the 10 tribes of Europe that come out after Rome perishes. And then we see this little horn that comes up as well. And so he looks a little schnai in this picture. Who is this? This is papal Rome. And it has to come from Rome because it grows out of the beast that represents Rome. And so it upplucks 3 when it pops out of the head of the beast. And so we actually see in history, in the textbooks of history, that there were actually 3 tribes that were erased by this power, and that was the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, and the Heruli. And so that brings us all the way to Daniel chapter 8, where Daniel is transported in this vision, and he sees this ram, and he sees this goat with a conspicuous horn, and they fight. And so Daniel is now having this vision 2 years. So if you can just imagine this, Daniel has already had this great vision, and it builds upon Daniel chapter 2, and Daniel is already confused about all these visions, and now he's getting another vision 2 years later. So we're going to read verse 1 together. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, the king had a vision, or of Belshazzar the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. So what this is saying is that he's having a vision, and this vision is directly corresponding to the vision he had previously. So we actually know that that it was given to Daniel 2 years ago, this vision in Daniel 7. Now this new vision is going to build upon that. So God is going to give Daniel a further revelation of what is to come. So this will build upon Daniel 2 and 7 with a deeper revelation, and we'll see a lot more details that we can see throughout history as well as it was fulfilled. Now, we go to verse 2. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam, and I looked in the vision, and I myself was now beside the Ulai Canal. Now, I just want to talk about the place that Daniel's at, Susa, the city of Susa. If we look at the bottom map, it's where it has that big red circle and it has Elam, that's where Susa was located. And we can see on that map where the Medes are, the Persians, and Babylonia. It's kind of right in the center of all of that. So that's where Susa is located. In the Babylonian Empire, Susa is actually a very important city that we'll come to see and find out. And some actually believe the Ulai Canal is the modern-day Karhay River. And so this is probably what it could have looked like. There's some people who think it's the Karhay River, but then some think that it was actually in the city of Susa, but just is now dried up. And so either way, this is something that maybe Daniel, when he was transported into this vision, just picture this, the top one or the bottom one, and picture a giant ram in that photo with it. That may have been what Daniel saw. It actually probably was more beautiful at that point because Susa was known as a beautiful city at the time. Now, if we continue on in verse 3 right there, it says, Then I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. So this ram is standing in front of this canal. And now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. So Daniel's seeing this ram come up and this whole scene happening in a place like this. I want to say that I think that the Ulai Canal was actually in the city of Susa, and here's why. Daniel further specifies that he was actually beside a canal. Because if we actually look at the Hebrew, some older versions of the Bible, when they translate it to English, they take the word and they turn it into river. So in the King James Version, for example, it was known as the Ulai River, but the word uval is not the normal word for river, nahar. And so it really is talking about a canal. It's something more man-made is really what it's insinuating. So Daniel is referring to what is now the dry canal that separated the royal city of Susa from the lower city of Susa. So we can kind of see that on the map here. If you look at the dotted line, if you see the smaller section that is separating, that's the higher area, the higher ground, and that's where the royal part of the city, that's where Daniel probably was in the citadel that is saying in the story, and he's looking out of the city, on the city, and that's probably where in his vision he's transported, is that where that dotted line is. So the canal was most likely located in the city of Susa, and we can actually see a picture of this in modern-day Susa, which really is Shush, is the actual area in modern day. Susa is no longer a city there, but we can see the remains of it, and it was a very important city. So the ruins that you're looking at right now would actually be the Persian ruins that is in Susa, ancient Susa. And so we can see that the royal city is elevated. The Ulai Canal, you can't really see it in this picture, but I'll show you a bird's eye view of the map in a second, and there's the lower city. And so when you look at the map, if you look all the way to the left, you see the Karhay River, which is something that it's something that some people would suspect that the Ulai Canal was. But really, if you look on the map, you can actually see through Susa that there was actually a dried up canal there. And so that's where I think Daniel probably was transported in a vision. It's not super important to the story, but I think it is kind of interesting. And plus, the fact that the ram comes up out of there and what kingdom that represents, this becomes their central area. This city actually is where they build their palace. And so that's why I think it makes sense that it comes up out of the city rather than a river next to the city. But we will continue talking about that in a minute. But more about the city of Susa. It was a beautiful city. It was the capital of Elam. It became one of the most important cities, like I was saying, in both the Neo-Babylon and Medo-Persian empires. Darius the First, this isn't Darius the Mede, but this is Darius the First, this is way after Daniel, later builds his palace here, actually, because it was his favorite capital. It was his favorite capital, and then his son Xerxes takes over and lives in this palace as well. And Xerxes is the person who then takes Esther to be his wife. So this is probably where Esther lived in this palace. That's why it's a very interesting place, because Daniel is actually having this vision in this city. And this city is also the city where Nabonidus was while his son Belshazzar was in Babylon. So Daniel was actually in the city having this vision where the actual king was just kind of vacationing. And so if you look at the ruins, this is the ruins of the palace that was built by Darius. This was after Daniel, but this is what's left there, and you can kind of see that in the picture. So then we go back to the vision. So now you have all that in your mind. Daniel's transported to the canal. He sees this ram, this goat, and we're going to read this together. And I underlined some important details that I want to talk about tonight. So verse 3, "Then I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram had 2 horns, was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last." And so if you look at the picture here, this ram, this one has a longer horn. And so remember that the shorter horn, which represents that it had less power, may have come up first, but the power that came up second was even greater. So that's what it's insinuating here when we look at the kingdom that it's talking about. And I also want you to think, I put that up on the slide, think about a beast in Daniel 7 that is similar, that has a similar attribute, that is close to the ram with 2 horns and how it was raised up. I would say it would look like the bear of Medo-Persia, but we'll see what the Bible says. Daniel 8, verses 4 through 5, "I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward." That will be important to indicate who it is. "And no other beast could stand before him, nor was there another to rescue from his power. But he did as he pleased, and he magnified himself." So there's the ram again. "But then I was observing, and behold, a male goat was coming from the west, over the surface of the entire earth, without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes." So here comes another beast. So now we're going to see what happens with these 2 empires. Verse 6, "He came up to the ram, that had the two horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. And so this nation, whatever kingdom this represents, it had a mighty wrath against the other. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him. So there again, he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his two horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. So here comes a great and mighty empire that comes and puts this ram to shame, when this ram actually was saying, who can actually stop this ram? Well, then this empire comes and completely demolishes it. Now, Daniel did not actually understand, once again, what was going on, and he was deeply troubled. But he really wanted to understand, and that's what I just love about Scripture and about these prophecies, is that not only does Daniel want to understand, but we would like to understand, and God supplies that and wants to help us understand. And so there before Daniel, someone, and I quote, with the appearance of a man who commanded the angel who serves in the presence of God, Gabriel, to make Daniel understand the vision. Now, who can command the angel Gabriel, and who has the appearance of a man? Jesus. So Jesus himself comes, and he's going to give Daniel some wisdom on what's going on in this picture of what's happening with these two kingdoms. Because Daniel's deeply troubled, and this isn't the first time that it's happened to Daniel, this is now the third time. And we actually see in Scripture, God says it so clear. So I don't think tonight we can actually be confused on the identities of these two beasts, because the Bible actually tells us straight up. Verse 20, the ram which you saw with the two horns represents who? The kings of Media and Persia. I don't think there's any confusion there. It's Media and Persia. Then who's the goat, right? The shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. And the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now, hold up a second. Daniel's being told this, but Daniel is still in Babylon under Babylonian rulership. So Daniel is hearing something that actually is going to happen way ahead, a couple hundred years ahead. And so this is actually troubling Daniel. In fact, even at the end, Daniel still doesn't understand and is sick for days. And I'm sure Daniel had heard of Media and Persia at that point, because that's in his neck of the woods, and they had been already causing some ruckus in the north and the east. But Greece, they're just a bunch of city-states. I don't even know, personally, I hadn't gone deep into this, but I don't even know if Daniel really knew about Greece that much. He may have heard a little bit about it. But Daniel is exhausted, nevertheless, for days, because how can all of this happen from where his point of view is very much, I'm still in Babylon. And this is what I've known most of my life, because at this point, he was an Israelite in Israel for not many years, and now he's been in Babylon for this great amount of time. So he's waiting to see what's going to happen, right? And Daniel actually probably thinks that this is going to happen in his own lifetime. And so then Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. Then I got up again and carried on the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision, and there was none to explain it. And that's where chapter 8 ends in verse 27. So Daniel still didn't fully understand it. But what's cool for us is that we can actually look into history and see how this was all fulfilled, unlike where Daniel was, where it hadn't happened yet. So we're going to look into the history of the earth's history, and then we're going to look into Daniel 7 and see some parallels, and then we can draw out some of these details that I underlined in the verses. So side by side here, it makes sense, obviously, that the bear with the 3 ribs in its mouth were also Medo-Persia, along with the ram and 2 horns. Now, here's where the details line up. It was raised up on one side with the bear, so it was lopsided. The last horn grew longer than the first. So there was an unequal power shift where one kingdom, where they may have had this co-alliance and intermarriage, one kingdom eventually reigned over the other, even though they technically were together. And so we see that, and we see that throughout the Medo-Persian history. So the Medes actually started first, and so the Median Empire really started in 678 BC by Deioces, and he united the Median tribes of Media, and this was actually the first Iranian empire. And so Media starts before Persia. And we can actually see the king lineage here through the Medes and the Persians, all the way from Deioces all the way down to Cyrus II, where that's the first time where they intermarried. And this Cyrus II is actually Cyrus the Great that took over Babylon when Daniel was there. So Persia then becomes the dominant side or horn in the prophecies, and in the secular books, they don't even consider it Medo-Persia, right? It's only known as the Persian Empire, not Medo-Persia. So reason being is because the one horn that comes second ends up being the more powerful one, and that's the one that is recorded in the history books of secular history books. New detail is given in chapter 8, though, that isn't given in chapter 7, that the ram butted westward, northward, and southward, which that also indicates that it kind of came from the east as well, which it did. And the Medes conquered, and they expanded their empire in the north, northwest, and then eventually west, and the south during their early years. But really, it was the north, northwest, and south during their early years of their expansion. And then during this power shift where the Persians and the Medes become more equally powerful, they go a little more westward. This is around the time where Cyrus the Great takes over Babylon. But then once Cyrus takes over, that's when the whole shift happens, where it's just basically the Persian Empire. And that's where much of westward is taken, including the three smaller empires of Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt, which are the three ribs in the bear's mouth. And so this ram did butt westward, northward, and southward, very much so, and none really could ever come against it. And at that point, Babylon had been the biggest empire, but this empire actually ends up being way bigger. And so they take over a lot more. So if we actually look at this, we're looking at when the Medes were more powerful than the Persians. So this is more of the Median Empire, but Persia is still there, and they're kind of in a co-alliance here. So the yellow is the Median Empire. The green that you see, the darker green, is the Chaldean Empire, which is Babylonia. Then we see Lydian Empire up in the northwest, which is the blue. And then we see Egypt down in the southwest. And so once Persia kind of becomes the dominant arm, we see this map change, and it takes over everything. So this is where the Persian Empire at about 500 BC looks like. So this is the Persian Empire in its golden age of where it had taken. So this was basically the known world at the time, especially in the Israelites' eyes. So Daniel 7, Daniel 8, where are the parallels with this? Daniel 7, it said that it devours much flesh. And then we know that nothing could stand against it, which we can see in verse 4. No other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue him from his power, but he did as he pleased and magnified himself. So no one could stand against this power of Medo-Persia. It was a force to be reckoned with. And so Medo-Persia, at the height of its power, this empire had conquered more than 6 times. So at its golden age, it had conquered more than 6 times as much of the land than its predecessor Babylon did. And so it did indeed devour much flesh compared to the Babylon Empire. There was no power ever in Earth's history like this until we get to the next power, which is seen in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. And so we see the parallel. What's the next power that it's going to be talking about? Well, we see in Daniel 7, there was a leopard with 4 heads and there was 4 wings. And so remember what we learned. It's very, very fast. Had 4 wings, and it was also a leopard. And so that means it conquered rapidly. And we're going to get into the history of it and how fast indeed it conquered, because it did. And Daniel 8, we have some new information, because on the left you can see all we know is that it's fast by the symbolism. But here in Daniel chapter 8, we know that it did not touch the ground. It seemingly kind of came out of nowhere, and it was enraged with the ram with a mighty wrath. And then the first horn, which represented what? It was the Greece's first king. This first horn broke after taking down the ram virtually instantly. And then it came from the west, which Greece came from the west. And so this came from the west, and it went over the entire earth. And so this is actually saying, when it says it came over from the west and engulfed the entire earth, it's basically saying that it's covering way more ground and land and conquering way more than even the previous empire, which we already know conquered more than Babylon. So it's just each beast as it goes, it conquers more and more. And so that's what we're seeing here. And so this is Macedonia, the land of Macedonia, and kind of the expansion of Macedonia, probably around when Alexander was alive. And so Alexander is actually from the land of Macedonia. So if you look at this, Greece is more than just this area at the end of it, but if we look south of these highlighted areas, that's where we see some of these Greek city-states of like Sparta and all these other ones. And so Alexander is the one that really rallies all the Greek city-states together to go against the Persians, because guess what? The Persians are annoying to them. They're tired of the Persian Empire trying to conquer them. So this is where Alexander grew up, in this area where it's highlighted. And Alexander the Great, he's from Macedonia. There's a reason why his name is Alexander the Great, and we're going to go over that. The horn of the goat equals the king of Greece, which was Alexander. He was the first king. He was very intelligent. And by the way, Alexander died at the age of 32, and his conquest of the Persian Empire lasted for 15 years. This guy was so intelligent on the battlefield, to the point where he never lost a battle during this conquest. Alexander the Great never lost a battle that he was leading in this conquest over Persia. And he actually was taught by Aristotle, by the way, which is one of the most well-known Greek philosophers. He was taught by Aristotle himself. And no matter how great Alexander was, it was short-lived because he died of unknown complications. And I've really dug and researched, and nobody can agree on what happened to Alexander, other than he may have gotten a disease, he may have had just a common sickness and just was weak at the time, or he had some sort of genetic health issue. We don't really know, but when he passed away, his whole body was embalmed in honey, and he died at a very young age. And so his greatness didn't last very long, but his legacy lasted forever, to the point where Alexander really is the only person that I can think of in history, besides a couple other people, where it says the Great at the end of it. So Alexander, he was, in fact, a very great person. Reasons for his success, well, during this time, there was this invention known as the catapult. Now, the world had seen other siege weapons. I didn't want to go too much into this, but the catapult was really the first siege weapon that was successful at crumbling down city walls and buildings. And Alexander had that at his disposal. The Greek Empire was very known for that. He was also very, very brave and active. So this wasn't just a general who was in the back, or he was out in a city and he would tell his army to go and send other people underneath him to lead the armies. Alexander was actually in the battle, killed many people as well, and he was very brave and active. And this is really the attitude that had the other city-states just buy into his charisma. So he was very charismatic, and this really bought him the other Greek city-states like Sparta, where Sparta is actually known for the Battle of Thermopylae, right, for the Battle of 300. And if these people were very, 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 very all about war, and even Alexander had enough charisma and bravery to get them to be united with him against Persia, which was a big deal. And so we actually have an account that I was reading about that Darius at the time, he was kind of a bit of a coward when it came to Alexander the Great after hearing all these stories. And in one of the battles, Alexander outnumbered him from 1 million troops. This is how many people Alexander got. It was 1 million troops, and Darius had 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,000. 47,0 It's crazy. Alexander was just that guy, and he was young. Like, all these other people probably were older than him, yet he was just that charismatic. He was able to get 1 million soldiers. And this is the aftermath. This is the map that he had conquered, and it may look small as the other maps, but really you're zooming out here. Alexander conquered way more than the Medo-Persian Empire, all the way going to India, actually, which is actually past where the Medes had conquered in the east. So he went from Macedonia all the way to India, down into Egypt. He had control of all of that. So this all happened in the course of 15 years. That's quick. This is very, very quick for just 15 years, and then right after he passed away. But before he did, I want us to talk about this. This is something that we read in Daniel 7, verse 12 last week, and it said that the first three beasts, which that Greece, Medo-Persia, and Babylon, they all are part of this, that the first three beasts were to be prolonged for a season and a time. And so I want to tackle that a little bit here, because Alexander, he married a lady named Roxanne, and she was a Persian princess, and he also encouraged 10,000 of his own soldiers to marry Persian wives. Pretty interesting, because it's actually very interesting when you look at the history of Alexander. His mother actually raised him to be very hateful towards the Persians, the Medes and the Persians, and that was why there was a very, very strong wrath that we see in prophecy of Alexander against the Persians. But then, later on, he ends up marrying a Persian, and I actually was reading that Alexander liked dressing up in Persian garments, because they were very fancy, and he actually enjoyed that style. And so he encouraged 10,000 of his soldiers to marry these Persian wives. And this is what came out of that, what was birthed out of that, is this Hellenistic culture. And this is a blend of Babylonian, Persian, and Greek culture. And this became the dominant culture of the land. And we can actually see some of that culture even still today in the Middle East. And this culture was dominant even in that area until after Christ. Even though the Romans had taken over everything, that's how much this influenced this, and that's why it was prolonged time, a season and a time, is because of this intermarriage and Alexander and everything that he had done. It was just so embedded in their culture that it just could not escape it, to where we actually see some of this still today of the aftermath of Alexander's life. And he only lived 32 years. So then we go back to this. What happens after Alexander? Well, we remember the leopard had how many heads? Had 4 heads. So this represents the 4 generals of Alexander. And then we have what comes after the horn that shatters? 4 horns. Oh, coincidence. So the 4 horns come in place of the first. And so we see that in that illustration there. And so these are the 4 generals. And so we learned about this last time, but you can go ahead and write those down. That is the last question, I believe, in the workbook. But this is what's interesting about this, is that Alexander actually had a son, but when Alexander died, there was no obvious or legitimate heir because his son was not born until after Alexander had died. So he was conceived before Alexander died, but he was not born before Alexander died. And so the legacy of Alexander's family halted, and it was given over to his 4 generals. So I'll give you a sec just to write those names down. And then we're going to look at a map, because I want you to visually see how this empire was divided between them. So if we look at this map here, it's not very equal, necessarily. One person really did get a lot of that land, and then there's another chunk of land down in Egypt that one got more of. I can't really read which generals got what piece of land, but this is how it was divided. And it was divided before the 3 generals. And then if we look at this, I just want to give this last visual here. This is the Daniel statue. And so if we just go back to Daniel and where he's at, Daniel is receiving all of this when he's still in the timeline of the golden head. So Daniel is receiving all these intricate, very detailed prophecies. In fact, God is actually telling him these are the kingdoms that it's going to be, while Daniel is still in the head of gold. And what's so awesome about this is that we know that Daniel is written before these things happen. And this is really where, for me personally, I can speak on this is where the Bible becomes alive. Because we can see that God had predicted this thing to Daniel. He gave Daniel a vision way before it happened. And then we look at history, and guess what? It happened. And so as we continue in all the different prophecies that have already still happened or have yet to come, we can see from the past in the way Daniel received these visions and it was carried out through history that God is faithful to his promise. And we know that in the first chapter of Revelation, it's a blessing. It's not something scary. It's a blessing for us to know these things, and God wants to reveal these things to us. And we can see that through these prophecies that God, even Daniel, he's unsettled. So if you've ever felt unsettled about learning prophecy, even Daniel was a little unsettled. But at the end of the day, Daniel went about his duties, and he trusted God. And that's what we can do as well. And so these are what these represent. And next time, we're going to go into this, and this is going to take a lot more time. Trust me, we're going to go into the little horn, because out of the goat's head, after the four horns, there emerges a smaller horn, if you read ahead. And we're going to be talking about that little horn as well. We're going to talk about the 2300-day prophecy, and then we're going to go into the sanctuary, because Daniel 8 is a vital, vital chapter into our own identity as Adventists, because it's built around the sanctuary message. So we are going to go over that next time. Let's go ahead and bow our heads for a word of prayer. Father, we're just so blessed to learn about your prophecy. We're so blessed just to see how you've given this vision to Daniel hundreds of years before it happened, and it was carried out. And we see your faithfulness throughout history, and how time and time again you predicted it happened, and that we don't need to stress about the things that are still yet to come, but we can have a deep joy and a deep peace in you, knowing that we belong to you, and that you want us to know these things, and that it is a blessing to know, and to make sure that we have details of what is still yet to come. And the best thing yet that is still yet to come is that you're coming soon to take us up in the clouds with you, and you're going to create the new earth. And we're going to have a life everlasting with you. So we thank you in your name. Amen. So I'm going to go ahead and open up tonight. If there's any questions, I believe that next time may actually have more questions, because it's going to get into more hot debated topics than this one. But if you do have any questions, feel free to come up to one of the mics. And I'm going to look to see if there's anything online as well.
Great job. Did a great job. There's one thing on there, however, that I just want to clarify. Mm-hmm. You were saying that Darius was a coward because he only had the less number. Mm-hmm. But when I was reading, I read that he actually had the millions of the army, and okay. Alexander only had like 37,000.
Okay.
And so I just wanted to...
No, I may have accidentally put it in there wrong.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah. And actually, you're right, because when I was going through that, it didn't make sense after a while. No, just to clarify, Darius did have the more troops. However, Alexander was not a coward, but all his other generals were. That's what It was, and I put it in there wrong. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, okay. All right.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for clarifying.
I didn't want to say anything to negate.
I felt like I couldn't come back to that after a while, but thank you.
Okay.
Do you mind? Oh. Okay.
This is like the third vision pertaining to the same subject. Why did God keep giving Daniel different visions, all pertaining to the same subject?
Well, so his question was, just so that online viewers can understand and I can reiterate it. His question is, since that Daniel had, why is it that Daniel had 3 visions, all going and pertaining to the same thing? And I truly believe that even though Daniel may have, and he was even given, in this vision, he was given straight up what these different kingdoms are, but I think really that this was for us. I truly believe that these visions were for us so that when we came back to this, reading it how many thousands of years later, that we can actually look through history and see these details that even Daniel didn't truly understand. And Daniel was actually given the names of the kingdoms, and he still didn't understand at the end of it. But now we can actually look through history. And so I truly believe that prophetically, this is for us as believers in Christ now. After all this has happened, we can actually go back and read this, and God knew ahead of time that we would need these details to uncover all the mysteries, and actually it would be helpful for us to believe in what God said about things to come. And I know that prophecy is a blessing because I think it strengthens our faith and our trust in God, because we can actually see how he's faithful to what he says is going to happen. Any other questions?
Hello. I don't really have a question, but I was kind of to answer that. One of the things that I learned when I had to teach junior Bible, I realize it's high school, but one of the things that I found with the prophecy and the repeating of them was something that I don't know if it's just termed this, but it was this repeat and enlarge principle. So when something would be repeated, it was almost like it would zoom into that same subject, and it happens all the time in Revelation 2, where it repeats it, but it's giving you more details, and it zooms in a little bit more and a little bit more. And I think that there was, when they talked about the chiasm of Daniel in these sections, in chapter 8, it's the first chapter that's just in Hebrew. Mm-hmm. And so there's like details that come out that are specific to Hebrews. So the enlarging is like specifically to the people of God and the details that only they would know, and not necessarily the people of whatever nation this was. I forgot already.
Well, thank you.
I just have a question about one of the maps that you showed. The first one I think was like, it was Media and Persia. Like the first one showed Media, and then the second one was supposed to show Persia, but it said like Media in the second. I mean,
here, let's go back to it real quick.
These two,
these maps.
yeah, that one, and then that one was supposed to be Persia, but like it still says Media, so I was just a little confused.
Yeah, so if you look here, because I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
So on the map itself, on the country, it says Media. But if you look down in the box down there, it says the Persian Empire.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if we go back and forth between these, because it has, the keys will reveal, because technically Media is still part of Persia, but Persia ultimately takes over, and this is what's known in the textbook. So I hope that clarifies.
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Curious, where did you get these maps?
He asked me, where did I get these maps? Very, very deep searches in Google, but also making sure that they're accurate as well, because on Google Images, you can go to the website where they're from and read about it, but yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? Let me check online real quick. Well, if we don't have any more questions, we'll go ahead and end there tonight. Thank you guys for coming out. And then next week, we're going to go over the part 2 of Daniel chapter 8, and it will probably be a lot longer because there's going to be a lot more in depth that we're going to go into in the sanctuary. So thank you all for coming.